On the night, everyone expected a powerful alliance to be sealed, a room filled with crystal chandeliers, old money, and men feared across 3 states fell completely silent because of one trembling whisper. The champagne had already been poured. The string quartet was still playing. Every eye in that grand ballroom was fixed on a young woman standing beneath gold light in a white gown that looked too beautiful for the fear sitting in her chest. Her name was Elena Carter, and at 24 years old, she had been dressed like a bride and delivered like a contract. Across from her stood Adrian Moretti, the son of one of the most feared men in the underworld, lifting a velvet ring box with the lazy confidence of a man who believed the night belonged to him. But before the ring could touch her finger, Elena leaned in just enough for only him to hear and whispered, "Don't do this." In that single moment, his hand stopped. The smile on his face slipped, and before anyone could ask what happened, the phone hidden inside Elena's clutch vibrated against her palm. She should never have looked. That was the first thought that hit her as her fingers tightened around the small silver bag hanging from her wrist. But fear is a strange thing. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't wait for dignity. It takes over the body before the mind can catch up. Elena pulled the phone just far enough to see the screen, and what she read drained the color from her face so fast that several guests nearest to the stage later said they thought she was about to faint. The message came from an unknown number. No name, no photo, no history, and just 7 words that turned a glamorous engagement into a countdown. If you say yes tonight, someone dies. She stared at the screen for less than 2 seconds, but it was long enough for Adrian to notice, long enough for the people closest to the front to sense something had shifted, long enough for the man standing across the ballroom, silent and motionless all evening, to finally step forward. His name was Vincent Moretti. To the public, he was a wealthy businessman. To the people in that room, he was the reason half of them were still breathing. There are moments in certain families where power does not need to raise its voice. It only needs to move. Vincent Moretti was that kind of power. At 52, he carried himself with the discipline of a man who had spent decades surviving betrayal by learning how to hide every emotion except control. He had not smiled once that night. He had barely spoken. He had stood at the far end of the room with a crystal glass untouched in his hand, his dark suit perfectly fitted, his face unreadable, while the guests celebrated the union of his son and the daughter of a struggling but respectable family who had suddenly become very important. But the one thing he could not seem to control was where his eyes kept going. Witnesses would later describe it in different ways. Some called it concern. Some called it suspicion. One long-time associate who had worked under Vincent for over 20 years said it looked like a man trying to stop himself from walking into a fire. And when he saw Elena read that message, he did the one thing no one in that room believed he would ever do. He stepped forward in front of his son, in front of the guests, in front of the alliance, and in a voice so calm it was more frightening than shouting, he said, "This engagement cannot continue." That sentence did not just stop a party. It split a dynasty in half. The musicians stopped mid-note. Glasses froze in the air. 2 of Vincent's lieutenants immediately moved toward the doors. Adrian turned slowly toward his father with a look that began as confusion and became humiliation in real time. Elena could barely breathe. Her mother gripped the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her father, who had spent the past 3 months telling everyone this arrangement would save them, looked like a man watching his last lifeline collapse in front of a room full of witnesses. But the most dangerous part of that moment was not the public shock. It was the private truth none of them yet understood. Elena had been promised to the son. The deal had been negotiated by men. The families had agreed. The invitations had gone out. The press had been carefully managed. But somewhere between the day she first entered the Moretti estate and the night she stood on that stage, the father had fallen in love with the woman meant for his heir. And by the time the truth surfaced, there would be no peaceful way to bury it. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Whether you're in Georgia, Moscow, Ohio, California, New York, Mexico City, Tokyo, drop your location below. And if you're new to this channel, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the truth behind this story is far bigger than a broken engagement. It is a story of a young woman traded for protection, a son who thought power was his birthright, and a father who spent his entire life building an empire only to risk losing it because he looked at one woman for too long. And if you stay with me until the end, you'll hear the final confession that changed everything the Moretti family believed about loyalty, inheritance, and love. What happened in that ballroom was only the explosion. The fuse had been burning for weeks, and to understand why Vincent Moretti stopped his own son's engagement in front of a room full of armed men, we have to go back to the day Elena Carter learned that her future had already been decided by people who never intended to ask what she wanted. Elena Carter did not grow up in the world the way people assumed. That's important. In stories like this, outsiders always imagine that every family connected to organized power is made up of willing participants, that daughters are raised expecting deals, marriages, and sacrifices. But the truth is often messier. Elena's father, Richard Carter, had spent most of his adult life building a logistics company in New Jersey that looked legitimate because, for many years, it was. He was never a made man, never a public figure in the criminal world, and never the kind of man who wanted his family near violence. He was a businessman who made one terrible decision in his 40s, then another, and then another after the first one needed covering. A loan here, a favor there, a shipment routed through the wrong people. By the time he realized who he owed, the debt no longer belonged to a bank or a private investor. It belonged to men who sent messages with broken bones and repayment schedules written in bloodless, polite language. The Carter family still had the house, still had the polished appearances, still had the Sunday dinners and charity photos. But under the surface, they were sinking fast, and everyone in that house knew it except Elena. For most of her life, Elena believed her family was simply under financial pressure. She saw the warning signs, but interpreted them the way daughters often do when the people around them are determined to protect a lie. Her mother sold jewelry and said she was simplifying. Her father cancelled vacations and said he was focused on expansion. Staff disappeared from the house one by one. Her younger brother's college plans suddenly became uncertain. Bills were paid late. The tension in the home thickened. But Elena, bright and observant as she was, still did not know the full extent of the danger until the evening she walked into her parents' study and found her father sitting in complete darkness with a glass of bourbon untouched on the desk. He looked older than she had ever seen him, older than his years, older than his body. He asked her to sit down. Her mother stood by the window, crying quietly without making a sound. And then Richard Carter said the sentence that would divide Elena's life into before and after. There is an arrangement that can protect this family. He didn't say marriage first. He said arrangement. That told her everything she needed to know about the kind of man he had become. The details came out slowly, and that made it worse. If he had shouted the whole truth, maybe she would have reacted with rage and left the room. But desperation has a way of dressing itself in calm language. Richard explained that the Moretti family had offered protection, debt relief, and long-term business stability in exchange for a formal union between their households. Vincent Moretti's son, Adrian, needed a respectable partner from a family that could still move in legitimate circles. The Carters needed their debts erased and their names kept out of investigations that could ruin them forever. It was clean, it was strategic. It was, in the minds of the men who built it, perfect. As Elena listened with the kind of stillness that scares parents more than screaming. When he finally said the words plainly that she was to be engaged to Adrian Moretti within the month, she laughed once. It was not a happy laugh. It was the sound of disbelief collapsing into insult. She asked the only question that mattered. And when exactly were you going to ask me if I wanted this? Her father looked away. Her mother cried harder. And in that silence, Elena understood the ugliest truth of all. There had never been a plan to ask. Her consent was not missing from the arrangement. It had never been part of it. There are many ways families pressure daughters into surrendering their future, and the most effective ones rarely come through force first. They come through guilt. They come through fear. They come through carefully chosen truths wrapped in emotional blackmail. Elena's mother told her this was temporary pain for permanent security. Her father said men were already circling the business, and that refusing would place all of them at risk. He said her brother's future would disappear. He said the house would be gone. He said the investigations would begin. He said people who once smiled at them in public would deny ever knowing them. Then he said, the line many daughters never forget when they hear it from a parent who should protect them. Sometimes, one person has to carry the burden so the rest can survive. Elena stared at him for a long time and realized he truly believed that sentence made him noble. In that moment, something in her hardened. She was hurt, yes. Furious, absolutely. But beneath both of those emotions was a colder realization. If her family could hand her over this easily, then no one in that house was coming to save her. Whatever happened next, she would have to survive it alone. She agreed to the first visit to the Moretti estate, not because she accepted the arrangement, but because she needed to see the people who thought they had bought her. That distinction matters. She did not agree out of obedience. She agreed out of strategy. Elena had always been sharper than people gave her credit for. She knew enough about men like Adrian Moretti to understand that the first meeting would reveal everything. If he was cruel, careless, arrogant, or weak, she would know where to press. If the father was the one truly in charge, she would know who the real danger was. And if the rumors about the Moretti empire were true, then the estate itself would tell her what kind of prison she was being invited into. The drive there took less than 90 minutes from Manhattan, but by the time the black SUV passed through the iron gates and began the long, winding climb toward the mansion, Elena felt as if she had crossed into another country entirely. The place did not look like a home. It looked like a fortress designed by someone who wanted beauty as a warning. Stone walls, armed men placed with invisible precision, security cameras hidden in architecture meant to look old and elegant, fountains lit like museum pieces, silence everywhere. Even the air felt expensive and dangerous. What no one told Elena before that first visit was that Adrian Moretti would not be there when she arrived, or that detail would change everything. According to the story later repeated by staff, Adrian had been delayed by business. According to one former driver who spoke years later, Adrian was in Atlantic City with friends, gambling and drinking, irritated that his father expected him to be present for what he called a staged merger with a pretty face. That version was never publicly confirmed, but everyone close to the family agreed on one thing. Adrian did not take the arrangement seriously at first. He assumed the deal would hold whether he showed respect or not. He assumed the girl would wait. He assumed his father would handle the details the way he handled everything else. That arrogance would cost him more than he understood. Because when Elena walked into the grand hall of the Moretti estate that afternoon, it was not the son who was waiting for her. It was Vincent, alone, standing beside the fireplace with one hand behind his back, looking exactly like the kind of man who had spent years teaching other men what happened when they miscalculated. And the moment he turned and saw her, the future everyone had planned began to crack. People love to pretend that powerful men fall in love through grand speeches or long courtships, but the truth is usually less poetic and far more dangerous. Sometimes it happens in a single look. Sometimes it begins with recognition rather than desire. Vincent Moretti had expected a social introduction, a political obligation. A young woman rehearsed to smile and nod while two families discussed optics. Instead, what he saw was a woman standing perfectly still in a room built to intimidate her, refusing to look away. Elena did not lower her eyes. She did not rush to greet him. She did not play grateful daughter. She stood with her shoulders straight, fear visible only in the tightness of her hand around the strap of her bag, and met his gaze like someone who had already decided that if she was going to be sacrificed, She would at least make the men responsible uncomfortable. Vincent later told one person that the first thing he noticed was not her beauty, though plenty of men in that world noticed beauty first. It was her anger. Controlled, quiet, elegant, but alive. He said it looked like the last honest thing in a room full of deals. And for a man who had spent decades reading weakness, greed, and lies in the faces of others, that kind of honesty hit harder than attraction ever could. He greeted her family with courtesy, but his attention kept returning to Elena. He asked her parents polite questions about the drive, the weather, the city. Then he looked directly at her and asked something no one else in that room expected. "Do you want this marriage?" It was such a simple question that for a second nobody reacted. Her mother opened her mouth first, ready to answer on her behalf. Her father shifted in his seat. But before either of them could speak, Elena said, "Does it matter what I want?" The room changed. People who had been standing comfortably a moment earlier suddenly became very still. Her mother whispered her name in warning. Richard Carter looked ready to apologize, but Vincent did not seem offended. If anything, he looked as though he had just been struck by a truth he had suspected, but had not yet heard spoken aloud. He studied her for a long moment, then turned to her father and changed the subject with such smooth control that anyone less observant would have missed what happened. But Elena noticed. She noticed the silence. She noticed the way his jaw tightened. She noticed the way his eyes held hers half a second too long before he looked away. And though she could not have explained it then, that was the first moment she sensed that the most dangerous man in the house was also the only one who had bothered to ask whether she wanted to be there. That first meeting should have ended with formalities. It should have been a brief, controlled introduction before Adrian arrived and took over the role assigned to him. Instead, it stretched. Lunch became an extended conversation. A tour of the grounds was offered. Her parents, eager to seem agreeable, but encouraged it. Elena remained guarded. Vincent remained composed. Yet under every exchange, there was a current neither of them was prepared to name. He asked about her education and listened to the answer. He asked about the non-profit work she did in the city and remembered the details. He asked whether she rode horses, because he had noticed the way she looked toward the stables as they crossed the grounds. She asked nothing personal in return, but she watched him carefully. She saw the precision in the way staff responded before he finished speaking. She saw the way grown men stepped aside when he entered a room. She saw how effortlessly he carried authority. And she saw something else, something that made no sense to her then. Every time her father tried to speak about timelines, contracts, or dates, but Vincent cut him off with the kind of polite firmness that sounded like courtesy, but felt like a warning. It was as if the man who had approved the arrangement suddenly could not bear to hear it discussed in front of her. Adrian arrived late, and when he did, the contrast was immediate. If Vincent was control, Adrian was appetite. He was handsome in the way magazine covers love, with easy charm, expensive arrogance, and the careless confidence of a man who had been told since childhood that the world would bend if he smiled at it. He apologized for being late with a grin that suggested he did not actually think anyone had the right to be upset. He kissed his mother on the cheek, shook Elena's father's hand, then turned to Elena and looked her over with the kind of casual ownership that made her skin crawl. "So this is the future Mrs. Moretti," he said, as if he were assessing a car he had been promised. Elena's expression barely changed, but inside, something cold settled into place. This was the man her family expected her to marry. A man who treated the arrangement like a luxury acquisition. A man who had not even bothered to arrive on time for the first meeting. A man who looked at her and saw not a person, but a prize. And what Adrian did not realize as he moved closer, taking her hand for a greeting he let linger too long, was that his father was watching every second of it with a silence that had already started to turn into something far more dangerous than disapproval. Adrian Moretti had the kind of charm that works best on people who only know a man in short doses. In photographs, at charity dinners, across crowded rooms, he looked like the perfect heir, polished, confident, handsome enough to disarm suspicion before it formed, But Elena had always trusted details more than appearances, and in the first hour of being near him, she noticed enough details to understand the shape of the future being forced on her. He interrupted people without realizing he was doing it. He laughed too quickly at his own jokes. He watched her like he was waiting for admiration instead of conversation. He asked her what she liked to do, then answered for her before she could speak. When Vincent suggested the families move into the dining room, Adrian slid his hand lightly against Elena's lower back, as though that level of familiarity had already been earned. She moved away so subtly, most people would have missed it. Most people. But not Vincent. His face remained unreadable. His voice stayed calm, yet the staff shifted around him, the way people do when they sense a room has become more dangerous without understanding why. Dinner that evening was meant to finalize what everyone else already considered inevitable. Elena's parents were visibly eager, almost relieved, as if being seated beneath the chandeliers of the Moretti estate somehow proved their sacrifices had been worthwhile. Adrian played the gracious host when it suited him, charming her mother, flattering her father, teasing his own younger cousins, and performing just enough warmth to keep the atmosphere from becoming uncomfortable. But the cracks kept showing. He spoke about business, as though every legitimate deal was just a front for something more entertaining. He made a passing remark about women loving the lifestyle that caused Elena's fork to stop halfway to her mouth. When she asked him what exactly he meant, he smiled and said, "You'll see. It grows on people." It was a small line, almost forgettable, but it landed like a warning. Elena did not smile back. Across the table, Vincent noticed, and for the first time that night, father and son looked at each other, not as family, but as two men who suddenly understood they were standing on opposite sides of something neither had planned. The conversation shifted when Elena's father, too nervous to leave silence alone, asked about engagement dates. He meant well, or at least he told himself he did. Men like Richard Carter often confuse panic with responsibility. He wanted assurances, signatures, timelines, certainty. He wanted the protection he had bargained for to feel real. Adrian, predictably, responded with the careless confidence of someone who had never paid the full cost of his own mistakes. He suggested a lavish engagement within weeks, something grand enough to make everyone pay attention. Elena's mother nodded too quickly. Richard tried to laugh, but before the matter could go further, Vincent set down his glass and said, in a voice so level it seemed almost gentle, "There is no need to rush." Adrian looked surprised. The Carter family looked confused. Elena looked at Vincent, and for one dangerous second, she thought she saw it. Not hesitation, not business caution, but resistance. It vanished almost immediately, replaced by his usual restraint. He explained that public timing mattered, that visibility required planning, that alliances built under pressure often failed under scrutiny. It was a perfect answer, rational, strategic, impossible to argue with. But Elena had begun to understand something unsettling. Every time her future with Adrian was discussed directly in front of her, Vincent found a reason to slow it down. The night might have ended there if Elena had gone straight to the guest suite prepared for her. But the estate itself felt too heavy to sleep inside. There was a pressure in the walls, in the silence, in the way people lowered their voices when certain doors opened. After midnight, long after her parents had retired and the last of the staff had disappeared into the invisible rhythms of the house, Elena left her room. She wore no shoes, only a loose robe over the silk dress she had changed into for bed. She told herself she was only walking to clear her head, only trying to understand the layout of the place, only refusing to let fear trap her in a room she had not chosen. But if she was honest, she was also restless because of the way Vincent had looked at her during dinner. Not constantly, not inappropriately. That would have been easier to dismiss. It was the restraint that unsettled her. The feeling that every glance he denied himself somehow said more than Adrian's constant attention ever could. She moved quietly through the corridor, down the staircase, and toward the far end of the west wing, where she had earlier noticed a faint light beneath a half-closed door. It was the library, not the decorative kind wealthy families show guests and never use, but a room that had been lived in for decades. Shelves rose to the ceiling. The lamps glowed low and warm. A fire burned quietly in the hearth. One wall held old photographs in silver frames. Another held first editions and leather spines worn by real hands. And standing beside the tall window, one hand resting on the back of a chair, was Vincent Moretti. He did not look surprised to see her. That unsettled her even more. He was no longer wearing the jacket from dinner. The top button of his shirt was undone. The severe perfection of the evening had softened just enough to make him seem more human, which in some ways made him more dangerous. "You should be asleep," he said. His voice was low enough that the words barely seemed to disturb the room. Elena crossed her arms and answered before thinking, "I could say the same to you." He almost smiled. It was the smallest shift in expression, and so brief that if she had blinked, she might have missed it. But there it was, the first crack in the man everyone else seemed to fear. There are conversations that feel ordinary while they happen and only reveal their importance later. This was not one of them. From the first exchange, both of them knew the ground beneath them was unstable. Vincent asked if she was uncomfortable in the guest suite. She said no. He asked if the staff had treated her properly. She said yes. He asked why she was awake. That was the question that mattered. Elena looked at the books, the fire, the shadows stretching across the floor. And then she looked at him. "Because I'm in a house where everyone speaks like my life is already decided," she said. And because the man I'm supposed to marry talks about me like I'm a benefit package." Vincent said nothing for a moment. Then he asked, "What did he say?" It was the kind of question a father might ask if he were merely concerned. But there was something sharper under it, something that made Elena answer carefully. She repeated the line Adrian had used at dinner about the lifestyle growing on people. Vincent's jaw tightened. His eyes lowered briefly, as if he were controlling a reaction he did not want her to see. When he looked up again, his expression had returned to calm. "Adrian can be careless," he said. Elena let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. That's a generous word for it. He should have ended the conversation then. A wiser man would have. He could have reminded her of boundaries, sent her back upstairs, or restored the distance that made the arrangement manageable. Instead, he stayed where he was. "You do not have to like him tonight," he said. "Few people do the first time they meet him." Elena leaned lightly against the edge of a nearby table, studying him. "And after the first time?" she asked. This time the smile was clearer, though still restrained. "Some people improve their opinion." She tilted her head. "Have you?" It was a bold question. Too bold, perhaps. The kind of thing that should have offended a man like him. But Vincent only looked at her with an expression she could not fully read. There was fatigue in it. Memory. Maybe regret. "He is my son," he said finally. That is not the same as an answer. The silence that followed stretched longer than either of them intended. Elena realized she had just crossed into dangerous territory, but what frightened her most was not that he might be angry. It was that he wasn't. It was that he seemed, for the first time that night, honest. And honesty from a man like Vincent Moretti felt more intimate than flirtation ever could. Then came the line that would begin haunting both of them. He straightened, putting just enough distance between them to remind himself what this was. "You are promised to my son," he said. It should have sounded like a warning to her. Instead, it sounded like a warning to himself. Elena heard it too. She did not move. "I know what everyone keeps saying," she replied. "That doesn't mean I belong to him." Vincent's eyes locked on hers, and for a moment the entire room seemed to narrow into the space between them. "Belong is not a word I would use." "Then what word would you use?" she asked. He did not answer. He turned slightly, as if the books on the shelf beside him had suddenly become the most important thing in the room. "You should go back upstairs," he said. "It's late." Elena stood there for one heartbeat longer, two, then pushed away from the table. She should have felt dismissed. Instead, she felt the strange ache of a conversation cut off too soon. As she reached the doorway, she paused and looked back. "For what it's worth," she said, "you're the only person here who's asked what I want." She left before he could respond. Vincent remained in the library long after the fire burned low, staring at the closed door like a man who had just realized the first rule he intended to break would not be business. It would be personal. The next morning, Elena found a single white rose placed on the table outside her guest room. No note, no card, no explanation. The stem had been trimmed cleanly, the bloom fresh, perfect, deliberate. Her first thought was Adrian, because men like Adrian often believe expensive gestures can replace character. But the flower felt wrong for him. Too quiet, too restrained, too thoughtful. Adrian's idea of romance was public, performative, and designed to be seen. This felt private, intimate, in a way that made her pulse jump before she could stop it. She looked up and down the corridor. No one. She touched the petals with 2 fingers and knew, with a certainty that should have frightened her more than it did, exactly who had sent it. She took the rose inside and hid it in the drawer of the bedside table. That small act mattered more than she understood in the moment. It was the first secret she kept in that house that belonged only to the 2 of them. She could have thrown it away. She could have confronted him. She could have asked a maid. Instead, she hid it. And in stories like this, the first hidden thing is rarely the last. By noon, Adrian had recovered from whatever effort it took him to be attentive. He invited Elena to ride with him into town under the pretense of showing her the world she was marrying into. Her parents, eager for the bond to form, encouraged her to go. Vincent said nothing. He stood near the front steps as the car was brought around, speaking quietly to one of his security men, but Elena could feel his attention even without looking directly at him. Adrian opened the car door for her with exaggerated charm. "Oh, come on," he said. "You should know what the Moretti name means around here." The drive began with small talk and ended in clarity. Adrian showed her the restaurants, the clubs, the properties, the businesses that formed the visible face of his family's influence. Everywhere they went, doors opened, managers rushed forward, tables appeared, smiles arrived too quickly. He seemed proud of how people responded, but he did not understand the difference between respect and fear. Elena did. By the second stop, she had already decided she would rather spend an hour in the silent library with Vincent than a lifetime being displayed by Adrian. The thought came uninvited. She hated herself a little for it. That did not make it less true. The clearest warning came later that afternoon. Adrian had stepped away to take a call, but assuming Elena would remain seated at the private table reserved for them in the back of an upscale restaurant overlooking the marina. He spoke in low tones, but not low enough. The confidence of entitled men often makes them careless with walls, doors, and distance. Elena heard enough. "I don't care about the girl," he said. "Once the papers are done, she's part of the package. That's all." There was a pause. He laughed softly at whatever was said on the other end. "Relax. You still matter. She's for the family. You're for me." Elena sat perfectly still. Her face did not change. Her fingers did not move from the stem of the glass in front of her. But inside, something settled into place with chilling precision. It wasn't heartbreak. She had never wanted him. It was something colder than that. Confirmation. Or the marriage was not only unwanted, it was insulting. Adrian did not see her as a partner, or even a person whose resistance needed to be managed carefully. He saw her as an accessory in a transaction he had no intention of honoring emotionally. When he returned to the table, smiling as if nothing had happened, Elena smiled back for the first time since arriving. It startled him. He mistook it for progress. In reality, it was the smile of a woman who had just decided she would never, under any circumstances, become easy to control. That night, Elena returned to the estate with a different kind of calm. She no longer needed to guess what Adrian was. The problem now was understanding why Vincent seemed to be slowing everything down while refusing to stop it entirely. She thought about the rose. She thought about the library. She thought about the question he had asked her the first day. And though she told herself she only wanted answers, the truth was more complicated. She wanted to see him again. That realization arrived like an accusation. It made no sense. He was older, powerful, dangerous. He was the architect of the world, trapping her, even if he seemed increasingly uneasy about the role. He was also the only person in that house whose restraint felt like respect. By the time the family gathered for dinner, Elena had composed herself. Adrian was louder than usual, as though he sensed distance and wanted to dominate the room with energy. Her parents overcompensated with gratitude. Vincent remained composed, but Elena noticed two things immediately. First, he did not ask Adrian how the outing went. Second, when Adrian casually placed his hand over Elena's as he told some story no one cared about, Vincent's fork stopped against the plate with a sharp metallic sound that made the entire table go quiet for half a second too long. After dinner, Elena did not go looking for Vincent. That's what she told herself. She walked through the west corridor again. Yes. She paused near the library door. Yes. But she had no plan, no expectation, no intention she was willing to name. The room was dark this time. For a moment, disappointment caught her off guard. Then she heard a voice from the terrace beyond the French doors. "If you came to read, I'm afraid I've failed you." She turned. Vincent was standing outside beneath the covered stone veranda, one hand in his pocket, the other resting on the railing. Rain had started, light at first, out the kind that makes everything smell sharper. Elena stepped out onto the terrace, hugging her arms against the cooler air. "I didn't say I came for the books," she replied before she could stop herself. The words landed between them with enough force that she almost wished she could take them back. Vincent looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said quietly. "You didn't." The honesty of the moment should have sent her inside. Instead, she stayed. The rain thickened beyond the edge of the roof. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled over the hills. And for the second time in 2 nights, the two people least allowed to want each other found themselves alone in a house full of people who would have torn them apart if they knew. "Did Adrian upset you?" Vincent asked. And the fact that he already knew the answer made Elena's chest tighten. She leaned against the stone column and looked out into the dark grounds. "Would it matter if he did?" she asked. "Yes," he said immediately. No hesitation, no performance. Just yes. She turned toward him then, really turned, and for the first time since arriving at the estate, she allowed herself to be fully honest. She told him about the phone call Adrian thought she didn't hear. She repeated the exact words. She watched Vincent's face change almost imperceptibly, not in surprise, but in anger so controlled it became colder than rage. "I see," he said. Elena let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "That's all you have to say?" He looked at her, and there was something in his expression she would remember long after everything else collapsed. Or shame. Not for himself exactly, but for the blood he had raised. "There are many things I could say," he answered. "Most of them would not help you tonight." Elena shook her head. "Then help me understand why this is still happening." Vincent looked away toward the rain. "Because some decisions become harder to undo once too many people know about them." That sounds like an excuse. It may be. And is that supposed to make me trust you? The corner of his mouth tightened, almost a grim smile. "No. It's supposed to keep me from lying to you." That line changed the shape of the connection between them. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a promise. But it was the closest thing to vulnerability Elena had heard from anyone in that house. She stepped closer without realizing it, to close enough to smell rain and cedar and the faint trace of whatever cologne he wore too sparingly to be obvious. "You keep talking like you regret this," she said. "Do you?" Vincent was silent long enough that she thought he might refuse to answer. Then he said, "I regret more than you know." "Then stop it." Her voice was soft, but it hit harder than a demand. "Stop the engagement. Tell my father the deal is off. Tell your son to find another girl to treat like furniture." A flash of something moved through his face then, gone almost as quickly as it came. Pain, perhaps, or the awareness that she was asking for something he wanted more than he had any right to. "It isn't that simple," he said. Elena let out a breath of frustration. That's what men say when they have power and still refuse to use it. For the first time, and Vincent looked genuinely affected by her words. He stepped closer, not enough to touch, but enough that the distance between them felt charged. "You think I don't know what power costs?" he asked. "I think you do," she said. "I just don't know yet what you're willing to pay." If anyone had seen them then, the story would have ended much sooner. No touching, no kiss, nothing overt. Just two people standing too close on a rain-dark terrace, speaking with the kind of intensity that strips away the lies both are still trying to tell themselves. Vincent should have stepped back. Elena should have returned upstairs. Instead, he said the one thing he had been trying to hold in since the first day. "You should never have been brought into this like this." Elena stared at him. "But I was." "Yes. And you let it happen." That landed harder than anything else. Vincent did not defend himself. He did not remind her of the business logic, the debt, the negotiations, the structures built long before she understood them. He simply nodded once. "Yes," he said again, and there was enough regret in that single syllable to make her angrier and softer at the same time. "Then why does it feel like you're the only one in this house who sees what it's doing to me?" The question came out before she could stop it. Vincent's breath caught almost invisibly. "Because," he said, and then stopped. The rest of the sentence never came. He looked at her mouth for half a second too long, then forced his eyes away. "Go inside, Elena." The fact that he used her first name in that tone, low, careful, or as if saying it itself was dangerous, sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the weather. She went upstairs that night, angry at him, angry at herself, and more awake than she had been in years. Sleep came late and shallow. By morning, the estate had shifted again. Adrian was suddenly attentive in a way that felt calculated. He sent flowers. Too many, too bright, too expensive. He invited her to lunch. He complimented her dress. He asked whether she preferred a ring with emeralds or diamonds, as though the right stone could erase the contempt she had heard in his voice. Elena played along just enough to keep him from noticing how completely he had already lost her respect. But Adrian was not stupid. Reckless, yes. Entitled, absolutely. Yet there was a predator's instinct under the arrogance, and by the end of the second day, he had started to sense something he could not yet name. He noticed that Elena's coldness toward him sharpened after any interaction with his father. He noticed that Vincent, who usually ignored emotional dynamics, had become unusually interested in the pace of wedding discussions. He noticed that the staff seemed nervous whenever Elena and Vincent were in the same room, even when nothing obvious happened. Suspicion rarely arrives fully formed. It starts as discomfort. A look held too long. A silence that feels different than it should. Adrian was not ready to accuse anyone, but he had begun, in his own way, to watch. The real trouble began with the cameras. Houses like the Moretti estate are never without surveillance. Every corridor, entry point, service entrance, gate, and exterior wing was covered by a system more sophisticated than most corporate offices. Adrian had grown up around it, and mostly ignored it, except when it suited him. On the third night of Elena's stay, after too much whiskey and a fight with Bianca, the woman he had been quietly keeping on the side for nearly a year, he wandered into the security office looking for distraction. One of the guards later claimed Adrian was joking, half drunk, telling them to show him if the princess had escaped yet. What he saw instead was nothing dramatic at first. Elena moving through the west corridor after midnight, the library door opening, no clear angle of what happened inside. Then later, the terrace camera catching two figures under the covered veranda. The resolution was poor because of the rain. No touch, no embrace. But close enough. Or too close, too still, too private. Adrian stared at the screen, first amused, then confused, then very quiet. "Rewind that," he said. The guard hesitated. That hesitation told him more than the footage. When powerful men are used to immediate obedience, even 1 second of reluctance becomes its own confession. He did not confront anyone that night. That was the surprising part. Adrian could be impulsive, but humiliation has a way of sharpening even foolish men. Instead of exploding, he smiled. He clapped the guard on the shoulder. He made a joke about how Dad finally found a hobby. Then he walked out and spent the next 2 hours in his room, not sleeping. By morning, he had convinced himself there had to be another explanation. Maybe his father was only warning her. Maybe Elena was asking for help. Maybe he was imagining the intimacy, because Bianca had already been in his ear, dropping poisonous little remarks every time Elena entered a room. But the seed had been planted, and once suspicion enters a family built on pride, it does not sit quietly. It grows, it watches, it tests. Adrian began creating little traps. He changed lunch plans without warning to see who reacted. He mentioned false meetings to see whether his father knew details he shouldn't. He told Elena he would be in the city, then stayed on the grounds instead. None of it gave him proof. But proof is not always what men like Adrian want. Sometimes they only need enough uncertainty to justify what they were already willing to do. Elena, meanwhile, was learning a different truth. The more she tried to keep distance from Vincent, the more aware she became of him. What had happened in ordinary moments, which made it harder to dismiss. The way he noticed when she was cold and had a shawl brought without comment. The way he interrupted one of Adrian's crude jokes with a change of subject so smooth no one else seemed to register it. The way he remembered she preferred tea over wine after hearing it once. The way his eyes found hers across rooms crowded with people who mattered to everyone except her. Attraction can begin with intensity, but attachment often begins with attention. That was what frightened her. Adrian wanted possession. Vincent offered nothing, and yet somehow made her feel more seen than anyone had in months. Maybe years. She hated that. She resisted it. She told herself it was only because he represented the only possible escape from the arrangement. But late that night, when she opened the drawer beside her bed and found a second white rose placed beside the first, though she was certain the drawer had been empty when she checked earlier, she stopped pretending she didn't understand what was happening. Someone in that house was helping him. Someone had become part of a secret neither of them had spoken aloud, and secrets inside families like the Morettis always come with a price. By the end of that week, Elena had made a quiet decision. She would not wait passively for the engagement to swallow her. If Vincent would not stop it, then she would find another way to force the truth into the open. She began paying closer attention to the house, the staff, the schedules, the whispered names that drifted through half-open doors. She noticed that Adrian disappeared at strange hours and returned agitated. She noticed that Vincent's top lieutenants treated certain financial discussions with unusual urgency. She noticed that one name kept surfacing whenever tension rose. Dominic Russo, a long-time associate with ties to rival operations and a reputation for smiling before he ruined people. Elena did not yet know how Dominic fit into the larger picture, only that his presence made Vincent more guarded and Adrian more reckless. She also noticed something else, something that would matter later. On 2 separate occasions, she caught the same maid looking at her with pity. Not curiosity, not judgment. Pity. It was the look of someone who knew enough to understand that the danger around Elena was no longer limited to a bad engagement. It had become personal, and in a family like the Morettis, personal was where blood usually entered the story. The final turning point of this phase came on a Sunday evening when the families gathered for what was supposed to be a small private dinner to confirm the engagement date publicly within the inner circle. The room was more intimate than the ballroom that would later hold the formal event, but no less tense. Elena wore dark blue instead of white. Adrian arrived late again, claiming traffic though he had barely left the property. Her parents looked increasingly anxious, as if they sensed the arrangement was becoming unstable, but could not afford to ask why. Vincent entered last, and when he took his seat, the atmosphere changed immediately. Richard Carter, eager to secure what he feared might be slipping away, raised his glass and thanked the Moretti family for their generosity. Then, with the clumsy optimism of a desperate man, he announced that it was time to finalize the engagement date and begin circulating invitations to select guests. Adrian grinned and lifted his own glass. "About time," he said. Elena felt the room close in around her. Then Vincent set down his napkin, looked directly at Richard and said, "There will be no announcement tonight." The silence that followed was so complete that Elena could hear the faint tick of the antique clock near the bar. Adrian's smile vanished. "Excuse me," he said. Vincent did not raise his voice. He never needed to. "There are matters to resolve before any public commitment is made," he said. Richard stammered. Elena's mother looked close to panic. Adrian leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "What matters?" Vincent met his son's gaze. "Family matters." Adrian laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "Funny. Since when do family matters delay business?" It was a challenge disguised as a joke, and everyone at the table knew it. Vincent's expression didn't change. "Since I said so." Elena watched the exchange with her pulse pounding. This was no longer subtle. Whatever Vincent was holding back, it was becoming impossible to hide. Adrian looked from his father to Elena, and then back again. And for the first time since she had entered the Moretti world, she saw something dangerous and childlike flicker in his eyes at the same time. The panic of a son realizing his father's authority might be standing directly in the path of what he believed belonged to him. He smiled again, but this smile was different, thin, controlled. "Fine," he said. "Then maybe we should all make sure no one gets confused about who she's for." He stood, walked around the table, and before anyone could stop him, took Elena's hand and lifted it to his lips. The gesture looked polite. The grip did not. Across the table, Vincent's face remained calm, but his knuckles whitened against the stem of his glass. And in that moment, whether any of them admitted it or not, the war had officially begun. From that night forward, the Moretti estate stopped pretending it was hosting a future bride and started behaving like a house waiting for a storm. The shift was subtle to anyone outside the family, but inside those walls, every glance became sharper, every corridor quieter, every meal more dangerous. Adrian no longer flirted the way he had in the beginning. He performed possession instead. He made a point of standing too close to Elena in front of others, of using language that emphasized ownership, or of speaking about their future, as if repetition could make it real. He sent her jewelry she never asked for, arranged private outings she found excuses to avoid, and began dropping little comments about how everyone gets used to this life eventually, as if obedience was simply another luxury he expected to be unwrapped. Elena gave him just enough politeness to keep from starting a scene before she was ready, but inside, her patience was gone. She had heard enough, seen enough, and felt enough to know that if she stayed passive, she would be buried under the weight of decisions made by men who assumed silence meant surrender. What Adrian didn't understand was that Elena had stopped being afraid of disappointing people. Now she was afraid of what would happen if she let them win. Vincent, for his part, became even more controlled, and that somehow made everything worse. Men like him do not become dangerous when they lose discipline. They become dangerous when they keep it, while every instinct in them is pulling toward something forbidden. He no longer lingered in rooms with Elena if others were present. He spoke to her less in public, not more. He avoided the kind of glance that could be interpreted. He created distance so carefully that, to anyone watching casually, it might have looked as if whatever tension Adrian imagined had been in his head. But private restraint often leaves louder traces than reckless desire. Elena noticed the details. Her preferred tea still appeared without explanation whenever she sat in the east sitting room. A shawl was left on the terrace one evening before she arrived, though the night had turned colder than expected. When Adrian insisted she join him for a late drive into the city, Vincent quietly reassigned the security team and sent his most trusted driver, a man known for intervening before trouble reached the car door. None of it was romantic in the obvious sense. That was what made it harder to resist. Adrian offered display. Vincent offered protection. Adrian wanted witnesses. Vincent made sure she was safe without asking for credit. And the more Elena noticed, the more she found herself resenting the fact that the only man in that house who treated her like a person was the one she should never have wanted. Their next real conversation happened in the training yard behind the main estate, a place Elena had not expected to find and would never have discovered without wandering beyond the manicured gardens into the part of the grounds where beauty gave way to preparation. The Moretti family believed in appearances, but they also believed in being ready. Behind the stone walls and rose hedges sat a private range, reinforced barriers, and a covered area used by security teams for drills. Elena had gone there by accident one afternoon while trying to avoid Adrian, who had been in an especially insufferable mood after receiving a call from Bianca that left him irritated and distracted. She found Vincent there alone, wearing no jacket, sleeves rolled to his forearms, speaking to one of the range supervisors before the man left them without a word. For a second, Elena almost turned around, but Vincent had already seen her. "Oh, you're a long way from the garden," he said. Elena looked around at the targets and the quiet stretch of private land beyond them. "Maybe the garden was getting crowded," she replied. He studied her for a moment, then picked up a handgun from the table beside him and asked, with a seriousness that immediately changed the air, "Has anyone ever taught you how to protect yourself?" The question startled her. "No," he nodded once. "Then today seems like a good day to start." If a stranger heard that line without context, they might mistake what followed for a simple practical lesson. It wasn't. It was the kind of intimate distance neither of them had been able to permit anywhere else. Vincent stood behind her, not touching at first, correcting her stance with quiet instructions. Feet apart, shoulders steady. Breathe before the pressure, not after. Elena had never held a weapon before, and the weight of it shocked her. Not because it was heavy, but because of what it represented. In the world she came from, violence was something whispered about after the fact, sanitized into headlines and rumors. In Vincent's world, it was preparation, discipline, survival. When she misjudged the angle, he stepped closer and adjusted her wrist with one hand, his fingers warm and steady against her skin. The contact lasted less than a second. It felt like a confession. Elena's breath caught, and Vincent removed his hand so quickly it was almost abrupt. "Focus," he said, though his voice was rougher than before. She fired. The shot cracked through the air. The target took the hit low and left. "Again," he said. They repeated the process until she stopped trembling, or until the fear in her grip turned into control, until the thing he was really teaching her no longer had anything to do with the weapon. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, when they finally paused. Vincent looked out across the range before answering. "Because in this family," he said, "people who aren't prepared get hurt first." Elena turned to face him fully then, the gun now resting safely on the table between them. "That sounds like a warning." "It is." "About Adrian?" He held her gaze. "About everything." There it was again. The honesty that made him more dangerous than the lies everyone else told. She stepped closer, too aware of the privacy, the silence, the fact that no one else was near enough to interrupt. "You keep saying things like that," she said. "You keep acting like you're trying to protect me from a world you're the reason I'm trapped in." Vincent's jaw tightened. "You think I don't know that?" "Then tell me the truth." "Which truth?" The question came too quickly, and that alone told her there was more than one. Elena held his gaze. "The one you keep swallowing every time we're alone." For a second, she thought he might walk away. His eyes dropped to her mouth, then back to her eyes. "The truth," he said quietly, "is that this should have ended the first day you came here." "Then why didn't it?" she asked. He took a slow breath, the kind a man takes when he knows the next sentence might ruin him. "Because I made the mistake of seeing you." The words hung between them like heat. Elena's heart kicked hard against her ribs. He should have stopped there. She should have. Instead, she whispered. And now? Vincent's voice dropped lower. Now I'm trying very hard to remember that you are promised to my son. Elena stared at him, anger and longing colliding so violently inside her she almost laughed. Then why? She asked, barely above a whisper. Does it feel like you're the only man in this family who wants to set me free? The answer nearly destroyed them. Vincent took one step forward, close enough that Elena could feel the heat of him in the open air. His hand lifted as if by instinct, then stopped just short of her face, hovering there with the kind of restraint that said he was already losing a battle he could no longer pretend was imaginary. Because if I let myself want what I want, he said, there won't be anything left of the rules I've built this family on. Elena did not move. Maybe the rules deserve to break. The words were reckless. True. Fatal. For one suspended heartbeat, neither of them breathed. Then Vincent's hand finally touched her jaw, barely, as if even contact had to be negotiated with his own conscience. He tilted her face toward him. She could see the fight in him, years of discipline colliding with something rawer and more human than he had allowed himself in decades. He lowered his head. She rose slightly toward him. The distance between them disappeared until there was almost nothing left but the possibility of impact. Then a voice called from the far side of the yard. "Boss?" The spell shattered. Vincent stepped back as though the air itself had burned him. One of his men was approaching from the service gate, phone in hand, face tense. Elena turned away, pulse racing, but every nerve in her body alive with the ache of what had almost happened. Vincent took the phone, listened, and his expression changed immediately from personal conflict to pure command. "Inside," he said to Elena without looking at her. "Now." She should have argued. Instead, she obeyed, because whatever he had just heard had turned the man who almost kissed her back into the king everyone feared. The call concerned Dominic Russo, and from that moment on, the danger around the engagement became more concrete. Dominic was not just a rival. He was a former ally with enough knowledge of the Moretti operation to be useful, and enough resentment to be unpredictable. Years earlier, he and Vincent had built pieces of the empire together, before a disagreement over territory, money, and loyalty tore them apart. Since then, Dominic had spent years trying to recover relevance by making himself a problem whenever Vincent appeared strongest. According to information Vincent's men brought him that afternoon, Dominic had recently made contact with Adrian without Vincent's approval. That detail mattered more than Elena understood at first. Adrian had been reckless before. But secret contact with Dominic meant recklessness was becoming strategy. It also meant the engagement might not simply be a marriage alliance anymore. It might be leverage. It might be bait. It might be part of something uglier than a son wanting to possess a woman he didn't respect. Elena only learned pieces of this in fragments, overheard from hallways, caught in abrupt silences, a glimpse in the way Vincent's men moved faster, and Adrian started acting as though the whole house was suddenly closing in on him. What she didn't know yet was that Adrian, stung by suspicion and hungry to reassert control, had already started planning a way to make sure the engagement happened, no matter who objected. Bianca entered the story publicly the following evening, though privately she had been there all along. She was exactly the kind of woman men like Adrian call a complication when they're done using her. Beautiful, sharp, patient, and far more observant than anyone gave her credit for. She had spent months believing she understood Adrian's place in the family and her place beside him. Then Elena arrived, and what began as irritation turned into insult. What Bianca knew Adrian was capable of taking a wife for appearances while keeping a mistress for pleasure. What she had not expected was that the new fiancé would somehow draw the attention of the one man in the family Adrian could never afford to compete with, his father. When Bianca showed up at the estate, uninvited, under the excuse of delivering documents for one of Adrian's side businesses, Vincent allowed her in only because turning her away publicly would have caused more questions. Elena saw her from the upstairs landing first, elegant, composed, wearing the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. Bianca noticed Elena at the same moment. The look they exchanged lasted less than a second and said everything. One woman was being used. The other had been used already. The tragedy was that both of them knew it, and neither yet understood how violent the fallout would become. That night, Bianca cornered Adrian in the lower bar and said the one sentence he had been trying not to hear from anyone else. "You're worried about the wrong affair." Adrian stared at her, drink in hand, expression hardening. "Careful." Bianca laughed softly, but there was pain under it. "You think I care who you marry? Please. I care that while you're busy treating that girl like property, your father looks at her like she's the one thing in the room he can't control." Adrian's face went still in the most dangerous way. "Say that again." Bianca leaned in, all elegance and cruelty now. "I think your father wants your fiancé." Adrian slammed the glass down so hard it cracked, but the reason the line worked wasn't because Bianca had evidence. It was because it aligned perfectly with the fear already growing inside him. He left her there without another word. By the time he reached the second-floor corridor, he was no longer trying to prove himself wrong. He was trying to catch them. That same hour, Elena received a folded note slipped beneath her bedroom door. No signature. No explanation. Just 5 words written in sharp black ink. "The truth comes out soon." Her pulse spiked. She checked the hallway. Empty. She looked toward the far end of the corridor where Vincent's study door stood closed. For one irrational second, she wondered if he had sent it. But the handwriting was wrong. The energy was wrong. This was not warning. It was anticipation. The night before the formal engagement, the estate lost power for exactly 90 seconds. To outsiders, that sounds like a minor inconvenience. In a house like the Morettis, it was a calculated event. Backup systems should have kicked in immediately. They didn't. Hallways went dark. The chandeliers died. The staff froze. Somewhere downstairs, a woman screamed. Elena was in the west corridor when the lights went out, and before her eyes could adjust, she heard footsteps moving faster than the staff usually did in darkness. Instinct took over. She turned toward the nearest open doorway, but before she reached it, a hand caught her wrist and pulled her sharply inside. The door shut. She gasped, heart slamming. Then a voice in the dark, low and close and unmistakable. "It's me!" Vincent. The relief hit so hard it almost made her knees give out. He was already moving, one hand braced against the wall, the other still around her wrist. "Stay here," he said. "What's happening?" "Someone cut the internal line." "Who?" "I don't know yet." That was the first lie he had told her in days, and they both knew it. He knew exactly who he suspected. The darkness pressed around them, thick and intimate. Elena could feel his breath. She could feel the urgency in his grip. When the emergency lights finally flickered back on, they found themselves in a storage room, barely larger than a walk-in closet, standing far too close, her body almost against his. Neither moved. There are moments in stories like this where the world narrows so completely that even danger becomes secondary. This was one of them. The emergency lights cast everything in muted gold. Vincent's face was inches from hers, harder and more exposed at once than she had ever seen it. Elena's chest rose and fell too quickly. His hand was still on her wrist. Neither seemed able to let go first. "Were you coming for me?" she asked, and the fact that she sounded hopeful made her hate herself and trust him more in the same breath. "Yes," he said. No hesitation. Just yes. "Why?" He gave a short, humorless exhale. "Do you really need to ask?" The room held still around them. Elena's free hand came up, not even fully consciously, and touched the front of his shirt. She could feel the tension in him, the restraint, the war he had been fighting for weeks. "Then stop fighting it," she whispered. That was the final permission neither of them should have given. Vincent's hand slid from her wrist to her waist. He pulled her closer. His forehead touched hers first. like he was taking one last second to remember the man he had been before this. Then he kissed her. Not hesitant, not careless. It was the kind of kiss that carried every unsaid thing between them. Guilt, hunger, protection, regret, restraint, broken all at once. Elena gripped his shirt and kissed him back with the desperation of someone who had been starved for choice and suddenly found it in the worst possible place. For a brief, stolen moment, nothing existed outside that room. Then the door opened. Adrian didn't say a word at first. That silence was worse than shouting. He stood in the doorway with the emergency lights behind him, his face pale with a kind of fury that had not yet chosen its shape. Elena stepped back instinctively. Vincent moved in front of her without thinking, which only made the scene worse. Adrian's eyes dropped to the space between them, to Vincent's hand still near Elena's waist, to Elena's flushed face, to the unmistakable truth neither of them could deny. "I knew it," he said finally, and the words came out almost softly. "I actually knew it." Vincent's voice returned to iron in a second. "This is not the place." Adrian laughed once, broken and ugly. "No, because it looks like the perfect place to me." He looked at Elena then, and whatever humiliation he felt turned immediately into cruelty. "Was this the plan? You pretend to hate me so he can play the hero?" "Enough," Vincent said, stepping forward. Adrian's eyes snapped back to his father. "You don't get to say enough. She was mine." Elena found her voice before Vincent could answer. "I was never yours." The words landed like a slap. Adrian stared at her, stunned for half a heartbeat, then smiled in a way that made her blood run cold. "Fine," he said. "Then let's see how brave you both are tomorrow when everyone's watching." He backed out of the doorway, gaze locked on Vincent. "Don't worry. I won't ruin the engagement." Another pause. "I'll make it unforgettable." Then he walked away. If there had been any chance of stopping what came next, quietly, it died in that storage room. Vincent wanted to cancel the engagement immediately. Elena saw it in the way he turned toward her the moment Adrian disappeared, already reaching for his phone, already moving into command mode. But before he could act, one of his men appeared in the corridor with information that changed the equation. Dominic Russo's people had been spotted near the perimeter, and one of the internal security channels had been compromised. That meant two things at once. Adrian had either been foolish enough to let Dominic too close, or he had intentionally aligned with him to force Vincent's hand. Either way, cancelling the event outright that night would not only create public suspicion, it could trigger open conflict before Vincent had secured the house and the guests. Elena watched the calculation happen behind his eyes, the personal and strategic colliding in real time. "You can't still let this happen," she said. Vincent looked at her with a kind of pain he could not afford. "I need one more day." Elena stepped back, as if struck. "One more day for what? To protect your reputation? To protect you? By putting me on that stage? By making sure no one can take you before I can shut this down properly?" She wanted to scream. She wanted to hit him. She wanted to trust him. All three feelings hit at once. "If you fail tomorrow," she said, voice shaking, "I will never forgive you." Vincent held her gaze. "Then I won't fail." The morning of the engagement arrived with the kind of cruel beauty only disaster seems to wear. The estate transformed itself into a spectacle of wealth and power. Floral arrangements lined the staircase. Crystal caught the light from every angle. Private security doubled at the gates under the pretense of high-profile guests. Men in tailored suits moved like shadows at the edges of the event. Elena was dressed in white again, this time in a gown chosen by her mother and approved by Adrian's team, elegant enough to suggest innocence, expensive enough to suggest surrender. She felt neither. She felt like a fuse. Her mother tried to cry and smile at the same time while helping fasten the last clasp at the back of the dress. Her father kept talking too much, the way guilty men do when they sense a reckoning close, but cannot yet admit it. "Once tonight is over," he said, "everything will settle." Elena looked at him through the mirror and thought with a clarity so sharp it almost made her calm, that he still did not understand what he had sold her into. Downstairs, guests arrived in waves: politicians, businessmen, wives with diamonds like armor, cousins who knew too much, men who had done terrible things and called it legacy. Adrian moved through them like a prince. Vincent stood at the edge of the room like a verdict waiting to be spoken. If you want to understand how fear behaves inside a body, you have to watch someone forced to walk toward a stage they are no longer sure they'll survive. Elena felt every step. The ballroom glowed beneath the chandeliers, richer and more crowded than the private dinner, louder but somehow colder. A string quartet played softly. Champagne moved on silver trays. Every major figure in the Moretti orbit was present. That was no accident. Adrian wanted witnesses. Vincent wanted control. Dominic, if he was planning something, wanted chaos. Elena descended the staircase with her father at her side, and the room turned toward her in one smooth wave. At the far end, Adrian waited near the raised platform, dressed in black, to smiling the smile he used when he wanted the world to think he had already won. Vincent stood off to the left, half in shadow, speaking quietly to two lieutenants who peeled away the moment Elena entered the room. Their eyes met. No smile, no nod, just the same promise he had made the night before, carried entirely in the way he held her gaze. I won't fail. Elena wanted to believe him. She also knew belief was a luxury she had run out of weeks ago. She reached the front. The officiant began. Adrian took her hand. His fingers were ice cold. Then came the message. Her hidden clutch, tucked discreetly near the folds of her gown, vibrated once against her side. The movement was small enough that no one else should have noticed, but Elena felt it like a shock. Her pulse spiked. She eased the phone out just enough to read the screen without turning her body. Unknown number. Same as before. 7 words, almost identical to the first threat, but worse because now the countdown had run out. If you say yes tonight, someone dies. Elena's breath caught, her face drained. Adrian felt the shift and leaned in slightly, mistaking fear for stage nerves. Relax, he murmured. You're making this look dramatic. She looked up, not at him, but across the room to Vincent. He had already seen her expression change. That was all it took. His posture altered by a fraction. One of his men moved toward the rear doors, another toward the balcony level. Elena wanted to speak, but the officiant was already inviting Adrian to begin. He turned to the crowd first, because of course he did. Thank you all for being here, he said, a hard voice smooth, amplified just enough to command the room. Tonight we celebrate family, loyalty, and the future. The irony of the words almost made Elena laugh. She could feel the phone still vibrating faintly in her hand, as if whoever sent the message wanted her to understand they were watching live. Adrian reached for the ring box. The room leaned in. Elena's body locked. The officiant smiled. Cameras from trusted insiders lifted discreetly. Somewhere behind the guests, Bianca stood near the back wall in a silver dress, watching with the expression of a woman who had decided if she could not keep the house from burning, she would at least stay to see who screamed first. Adrian opened the box and took the ring between 2 fingers. Elena Carter, he said, loud enough for the room, soft enough to sound intimate. Now, from the moment I saw you, don't do this. The whisper came from Elena before she could stop it. Adrian froze. The line was not planned. It was not theatrical. It was the kind of raw, involuntary truth that cuts through rehearsed ceremonies like broken glass. He looked at her, stunned. What? She barely shook her head, eyes wide, fear and fury colliding in her chest. Don't. That was the exact second Vincent moved. He stepped out from the side of the room and onto the line between them and the guests, his voice carrying without the microphone, because silence had already made the room his. This engagement cannot continue. The ballroom stopped breathing. Even the quartet fell apart mid-note. Adrian turned slowly toward his father, ring still in hand, disbelief giving way to rage. What did you just say? Vincent didn't look at him first. He looked at Elena. He saw the phone. He saw the terror. Then he looked at the room. I said, he repeated, each word colder than the last. "This engagement is over." Chaos did not erupt all at once. It cracked outward in layers. Elena's mother gasped and sat down too hard. Richard Carter stood halfway, face ashen, already trying to calculate whether this meant financial ruin or something worse. Guests began whispering. 2 lieutenants closed the main doors. Adrian laughed, but the sound was unstable, almost disbelieving. "You don't get to humiliate me in front of everyone because you changed your mind." Vincent stepped closer. "This isn't about my mind." "No?" Adrian's voice rose now, pride splitting open in public. "Then what is it about?" Vincent's answer came before caution could stop it. "It's about the fact that she was never yours to claim." The room seemed to physically recoil. There are sentences that expose more than the speaker intends, and this was one of them. Adrian stared at his father as the meaning landed. Elena closed her eyes for half a second, because there it was, spoken in public now, the truth everyone had been circling. Bianca smiled in the back like someone watching a fuse reach the charge. Adrian's face changed, not just anger now, betrayal, childish, wounded, vicious betrayal. "Say it," he demanded. "Go ahead. Say what everyone's already thinking." Vincent's expression hardened. "This ends now." "No," Adrian snapped, taking a step toward him. "Now it starts." And then Bianca lit the match. Whether she had planned it or simply seized the perfect moment remains unclear, but several witnesses later confirmed that a private projection screen meant for the family montage flickered unexpectedly to life behind the stage. At first, people thought it was a technical error. Then the image sharpened. Grainy security footage. The West Terrace in the rain. 2 figures standing close beneath the covered stone roof. Vincent and Elena. No kiss visible there, but intimacy undeniable. The clip changed. A still frame from the storage room corridor, taken from a side angle, enough to show Vincent pulling back from Elena, his hand near her waist, her face lifted toward him. Gasps rippled through the ballroom like a wave. Adrian turned toward the screen, then back toward his father, and something in him snapped completely. "You disgusting bastard!" he shouted. The ring box hit the floor. Elena stepped back instinctively. Vincent moved in front of her again. "Security!" he barked, but it was already too late for order. Guests were rising. Voices were colliding. Bianca stood very still at the back, expression unreadable now that the thing she had set loose had become larger than revenge. Adrian pointed at Elena, then Vincent. "You made me stand here and ask for a woman you were already touching." "Enough," Vincent said. "Enough?" Adrian was nearly laughing with fury now. "She's supposed to be my fiancé." Elena's voice cut through him like steel. "I was never your fiancé. I was your father's deal, your grandfather's legacy, my father's debt, and your convenience. I was never yours." That line would be repeated in whispers for years after. It hit the room harder than the footage. It stripped away the glamour, the family branding, the performance of tradition, and exposed the truth for what it was. A transaction dressed as destiny. Adrian stared at her as if he had never seen her before. For a moment, it looked like the humiliation might finally turn inward into the kind of silence that breaks a man privately. It didn't. It turned outward instead. He reached inside his jacket. Vincent moved before anyone else understood why. "Don't," he warned. Adrian pulled a gun. Screams tore through the ballroom. Glass shattered somewhere near the bar. Elena's mother collapsed into a chair. Richard Carter stumbled backward. 3 of Vincent's men drew immediately, but none had a clear shot without risking the crowd. Adrian's hand was shaking, which made him more dangerous, not less. "You don't take everything from me," he shouted. "You never let me have anything." The words, raw and childish, revealed the truth beneath all his swagger. This was not just about Elena. It was about a lifetime of being the heir without ever being the equal. The son who wore the crown in public, but still stood in the shadow of the man who built the throne. "Adrian," Vincent said, voice low and deadly calm. "Put it down." Adrian aimed, not at Vincent first, but at Elena. That told everyone in the room exactly what kind of man he had become. Before he could fire, a shot rang out from the balcony level. For a split second, no one knew whose bullet it was. Then Adrian staggered. The gun dropped from his hand. Blood spread dark and fast across his shoulder. He fell to one knee, shock overtaking rage. Guests screamed and ducked, but Vincent's men surged forward. Elena froze. Vincent turned instinctively toward the balcony, and that was when the real twist stepped into view. Dominic Russo. He emerged from the upper corridor with 2 armed men and a smile that belonged in a nightmare. "Well," he called down, voice almost amused. "This family event turned out better than I hoped." The room shifted from scandal to siege in an instant. Dominic had used the emotional chaos as cover. Whether he had sent the anonymous messages, cut the power the night before, or fed Bianca the footage no longer mattered in the immediate sense. He had done what men like him always did best, waited for a wound, then pressed deeper. "You always did like making scenes, Vincent," Dominic said. "I figured if your son couldn't bring the house down properly, I'd help." Vincent's face became something colder than anger. "You're a dead man," Dominic laughed. "Maybe. But first, let's talk about your heir. He's been selling me information for months." The room went silent again, but this time from a different kind of horror. Adrian, bleeding on the floor, looked up in stunned fury. "Shut up." Dominic kept smiling. He wanted leverage, thought the engagement would force your hand, thought the girl made him valuable. He looked directly at Elena. Turns out she made everyone stupid. There it was, the final betrayal that rewrote everything. Adrian had not merely been reckless, he had been feeding information to Dominic, trying to strengthen his own position within the family by creating pressure his father couldn't ignore. The engagement was never just a marriage alliance to him. It was proof of control. Elena was not the woman he wanted. She was the symbol he believed would finally make Vincent treat him like an equal. And when suspicion about Vincent and Elena began to grow, Adrian doubled down instead of backing away. He leaked schedules. He allowed internal vulnerabilities. He may even have helped stage the blackout, believing he could use the tension to trap them or expose them on his terms. Dominic, being Dominic, simply let the son believe he was playing chess while quietly setting the whole board on fire. Elena felt sick. Her father looked as if he might collapse. The man who had sold her into this arrangement had never imagined the arrangement itself might already be compromised from the inside. Vincent, meanwhile, moved with terrifying clarity. "Lock the exits," he ordered. "No one leaves." Dominic raised his gun. Too late. The first real volley of gunfire broke out seconds later, and the ballroom that had been prepared for an engagement turned into a war zone. In the chaos that followed, Elena would later remember only fragments with perfect clarity. The sound of crystal exploding, the smell of smoke, her mother screaming her name, a bodyguard shoving guests to the floor, Adrian trying to crawl toward the dropped gun with blood on his sleeve, Bianca disappearing behind an overturned table, survival finally mattering more than revenge. Vincent turning, seeing Dominic's second man angle toward Elena from the side corridor, and moving before thought could slow him. He hit her hard enough to knock her behind the stage platform, just as a bullet tore through the air where her chest had been. She slammed into the carpet, breathless, ears ringing. Vincent was already firing back. Men shouted. Someone went down near the staircase. Dominic retreated toward the balcony rail, still firing in bursts. Elena's body shook, but the training Vincent had forced on her returned in pieces. She saw a sidearm on the floor near one of the fallen guards, grabbed it with trembling hands, checked it the way he had taught her, and stayed low. She wasn't thinking about morality anymore. She was thinking about survival. She wasn't thinking about whether she belonged in this world. She was already in it, and it was trying to kill her. When Dominic's third man came around the edge of the stage, gun raised, Elena fired once. The shot hit him high in the chest. He fell before she had time to understand what she had done. Across the room, yet Vincent saw it. In the middle of gunfire, smoke, panic, and blood, he saw Elena survive because she had listened to him in the training yard. That moment would haunt him almost as much as it saved her. Dominic tried to use the confusion to break toward the service corridor, but Vincent cut him off near the base of the balcony stairs. Their final confrontation lasted less than 10 seconds and carried 20 years of history. "You should have stayed gone," Vincent said. Dominic smiled, breathless and reckless. "You should have taught your son loyalty." Dominic fired first and missed. Vincent didn't. 2 shots, center mass. Dominic hit the railing, then the floor. Just like that, the man who had spent years circling the Moretti empire as a threat finally stopped moving in the middle of the engagement he had helped destroy. The remaining shooters were subdued within moments. The ballroom, once full of whispers and spectacle, became a field of overturned chairs, shattered glass, sobbing guests, and men with guns securing bodies and exits. Elena stood slowly from behind the stage, still holding the weapon, white gown stained at the hem, face pale and fierce and unrecognizable from the woman who had walked down the staircase less than an hour earlier. Vincent looked at her from across the wreckage. In that look was everything: relief, guilt, pride, grief, and the knowledge that nothing about them could ever go back. Adrian survived. That, depending on who tells the story, was either mercy or punishment. He was taken from the ballroom under armed guard, bleeding but conscious, screaming at first, then cursing, then finally going quiet when he realized no one in the room was willing to call him the victim. His betrayal had been spoken aloud in front of witnesses. Dominic's accusation matched evidence Vincent's men would later recover from Adrian's private devices and offshore accounts. Encrypted messages, payment trails, schedule leaks, enough to make even the family loyalists stop defending him. In the old days, a son who did what Adrian had done might have disappeared before sunrise. But Vincent, for all his brutality, understood symbolism. Adrian had wanted public validation. He would get public consequences instead. By dawn, the inner circle knew the truth. The heir had compromised the family for leverage, endangered a protected alliance, and attempted violence against the very woman he was meant to marry. Whether formal law touched him or not became almost irrelevant. Within the Moretti structure, he was finished. No inheritance, no command, no title worth carrying. He was no longer the future. And if that should have brought Vincent satisfaction, it didn't. The cost of seeing the truth clearly was realizing he had built part of the man who nearly killed the woman he loved. When the police finally arrived, they received the version of events powerful families prefer to offer the world: an attempted attack by outside rivals during a private engagement event, resulting in casualties, injuries, and the tragic exposure of an internal security breach. Dominic Russo was named the primary aggressor. That part was true. Adrian's role was buried just enough to keep the Moretti name from bleeding into the press, but not enough to restore his place in the family. The Carter family, shaken and disgraced in equal measure, were quietly relocated under Vincent's protection, whether Elena wanted that or not. Richard Carter aged 10 years in a single night. He tried to apologize to his daughter twice in the 48 hours that followed. The first time, she walked away before he finished the sentence. The second time, she listened, then said the one thing he would never be able to forget. "You didn't lose me that night in the ballroom. You lost me the day you decided I was a price worth paying." Her mother cried. Her brother, finally old enough to understand the shape of the betrayal, refused to speak to his father for weeks. Families do not recover from truths like that quickly. Sometimes they never do. The damage is not in the shouting. It is in the clarity that follows. And what of Elena and Vincent? That is the question everyone asks, because in stories like this, people always want the romance to rise cleanly out of the wreckage. Real life rarely gives clean endings. The morning after the engagement, once the doctors had come and gone, once the guests had been moved, once the bodies had been removed and the ballroom sealed, Elena stood alone on the back terrace overlooking the rain-dark gardens, where weeks earlier she had first realized how dangerous honesty could be. The white gown was gone. She wore a simple black dress borrowed from one of the house staff because her own clothes had been damaged in the chaos. Her hair was down. Her hands were steady now, though the skin at her knuckles still carried a faint burn from the recoil of the gun. She heard him before she saw him. Vincent stepped onto the terrace slowly. No entourage, no title, no performance. Just the man. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them no longer felt like tension. It felt like aftermath. Finally, Vincent said, "The car is ready if you want to leave." Elena turned to him. "And if I do?" He held her gaze. "Then you leave with my protection, your family safe, your name clear, and no one will ever force another decision on you again." She studied him carefully. "And if I stay?" His expression shifted in a way only she would have noticed. "Then you stay because you choose to. Not because your father signed something. Not because my son demanded it. Not because I asked. Because you choose." It was the most honest offer he had ever made her, and perhaps the only one that could have meant anything after all that had happened. Elena stepped closer, but not all the way. "Do you know what I hate most?" she asked. Vincent's voice was quiet. "Probably several things about me." For the first time in days, she almost smiled. "I hate that the most dangerous man in the room was the only one who ever tried to give me a choice." He said nothing. Maybe because there was nothing safe to say. Maybe because he knew any defense would cheapen the truth. Elena looked out at the grounds, at the estate that had almost become her prison, and had instead become the place where every illusion around her was shattered. "I don't know what this is yet," she said. "Neither do I," Vincent replied. "I only know what it isn't." She looked back at him. "And what is that?" His answer came with the weight of a vow. "It isn't ownership. It isn't a transaction. It isn't obligation." The wind moved between them. Somewhere inside the house, distant voices carried through open halls, the machinery of cleanup and damage control still underway. "Good," Elena said, "because if I choose anything now, it will be on my terms." Vincent nodded once. "Then those are the only terms that matter." She stepped into him then, not dramatically, not like a fairy tale ending, but like a woman who had finally reclaimed the right to decide who touched her and why. When he kissed her this time, there was no secrecy left in it, only consequence. That should be where the story ends. But the reason this case still circulates in whispers among people who know pieces of it is because of what came after. That Vincent Moretti did not simply keep Elena near and carry on as if the engagement had been an unfortunate detour. He dismantled the very structure that had made the arrangement possible. Quietly at first, then more visibly over the following year, he restructured the business side of the family empire, pulling power away from the older men who still believed daughters were bargaining chips and sons were owed inheritance no matter what they became. Several long-standing alliances were dissolved. The Carter debt was erased without condition. Properties Adrian had expected to inherit were sold or reassigned. Internal codes changed. Staff who had facilitated silence were replaced. People who had mistaken tradition for immunity learned that Vincent's most ruthless act might not have been killing enemies. It might have been admitting that the rules he had lived by had nearly destroyed the only thing he valued enough to break them for. Elena, meanwhile, did not become a trophy at his side. She took time away. She left the estate for weeks. She returned only after the first wave of chaos settled, and even then on her own terms. She did not move into his room. She did not accept a ring. She did not become the silent queen of a dark empire. She became something more unsettling to the people around them. A woman who had seen the machine from the inside, survived it, and refused to let love excuse the damage it had done. Months later, when one of Vincent's oldest associates made the mistake of referring to Elena in a private meeting as the boss's woman, Vincent ended the conversation with a line that spread through the inner circle faster than any threat. "No," he said, "she's the woman who taught me my son, and my enemies were not the only things I had been wrong about." It was not romantic in the way people expect. It was bigger than that. It was confession, accountability. The kind of sentence powerful men avoid, because once spoken, They cannot go back to pretending ignorance is innocence. Elena heard about the line days later and said nothing at first. Then, according to the only person who was in the room when she responded, she smiled and said, "Good. Let him keep learning." That was Elena's final victory in the eyes of many who knew the truth. She did not simply survive the Moretti family, she changed it. Not with innocence, not with fantasy, not by pretending love washed away violence. She changed it by forcing the most powerful man in that world to face what he had built, what it had cost, and what he would have to tear down if he wanted to deserve the future he was asking for. So when people ask what really happened the night Elena Carter was supposed to become Adrian Moretti's fiancée, the answer depends on what part of the story they care about most. If they want scandal, they hear about the father who stopped his own son's engagement because he had fallen for the bride. If they want blood, they hear about the rival who crashed the ballroom and the son who drew a gun on the woman he claimed to want. If they want betrayal, they hear about the father who sold his daughter, the heir who sold family secrets, and the mistress who lit the fuse out of spite. But if they want the truth, the full truth, it is this. A young woman was handed to a powerful family as payment, and in the middle of a world built on control, she became the one person who refused to be owned. She stood in a white dress in a room full of men who thought they understood power, and by the time the night was over, she had exposed every one of them for what they really were. Some were weak. Some were cruel. One was dangerous enough to change. And in families like the Morettis, that may be the rarest thing of all. Before we close this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, because I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And tell me this, if you were Elena, what would you have walked away from Vincent after everything that happened? Or would you have stayed and risked building something real with the man who nearly lost everything for you? And if you thought this story was intense, wait until you hear the next one. Because sometimes the most shocking betrayals don't happen between enemies. Sometimes they happen at the family table, long before anyone realizes the price of staying silent.